Mr. Hill, what has television given you?
Well, nervous dyspepsia, indigestion, heartburn, all sorts of things like that, you know.
There are moments in television history that don't just make headlines, they rewrite them. Moments where the laugh track falls silent, where the audience shifts uncomfortably in their seats, and where the people holding the keys to a beloved program quietly begin to wonder whether it's time to turn off the lights for good. For The Benny Hill Show, that moment came not with a dramatic announcement or a public scandal, but with something far more insidious, a slow and painful realization that the world had moved on and the show had not moved with it. For more than 3 decades, Benny Hill was a fixture of British television. His name alone was enough to conjure images of madcap chases, exaggerated characters, scantily clad women running across sun-drenched parks, and the unmistakable brass notes of yakety sax blaring through living room speakers on a weeknight. He was beloved, he was celebrated, and at the peak of his powers, he was watched by over 21 million people in Britain alone. His show was broadcast in more than 140 countries. He had fans in places where most British comedians were virtually unknown. And then, in 1989, it was over. Thames Television pulled the plug on The Benny Hill Show after 21 years of production, citing declining ratings, rising costs, and a cultural climate that had grown deeply uncomfortable with the kind of humor Hill had built his career on. But the cancellation didn't happen overnight. It was the culmination of years of mounting criticism, a changing media landscape, and one particular type of comedy, centered on the objectification and pursuit of women, that had finally pushed the show beyond the point of no return. To understand how The Benny Hill Show ended, you have to understand how it began, who built it, and why for so many years, nobody seemed to think there was anything wrong with it at all. Alfred Hawthorne Hill was born on January 21st, 1924, in Southampton, Hampshire, England. He grew up in a household that was working class in its means, but rich in its connection to performance. His grandfather, Henry Hill, had worked as a circus clown, and while his father, Alfred Sr., ran a surgical appliance shop, the DNA of entertainment clearly ran deep in the family bloodline. Young Alfred was not an obvious candidate for stardom. He attended Taunton School in Southampton and showed no particular academic distinction that pointed toward a future in comedy. What he did show was an extraordinary curiosity about people, the way they moved, the way they talked, the way they reacted to embarrassment and surprise. Before he ever stepped onto a stage, he worked at Woolworths, drove trucks, operated a bridge, delivered milk, and played drums. Each of these jobs gave him something invaluable, an intimate, ground-level understanding of ordinary life. An ordinary life, rendered absurd, would become the engine of everything he created. His path in entertainment began with a role as an assistant stage manager on a touring revue. It was unglamorous, behind-the-scenes work, but it taught him the mechanics of performance. Timing, staging, the invisible architecture that makes a joke land or collapse. When World War II broke out, Hill was called up from military service and trained as a mechanic in the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers. He served in Normandy in September 1944, working as a truck driver and searchlight operator during one of the most consequential campaigns in modern history. But it was his transfer to the Combined Services Entertainment Division before the war's end that truly shaped his future. The CSE existed to boost morale among British and Allied troops, putting comedians and performers in front of audiences who were exhausted, frightened, and hungry for laughter. Hill discovered in those performances something that would define his entire career: the power of comedy to create an instant, visceral connection between performer and audience. He learned to read a room. He learned to push a joke until it broke, and then push it just a little further. He learned that laughter, when it comes from a genuine place, is one of the most generous things a human being can offer another. He adopted his stage name as a tribute to his idol, the American comedian Jack Benny, whose impeccable timing and deadpan delivery Hill deeply admired. From that point forward, he was Benny Hill, and Benny Hill was going places. Hill's early career moved through radio before it found its true home on television. He made his debut on the popular radio program Variety Bandbox in October 1947, and his quick wit and instinctive comic timing quickly built him a following among listeners who responded to his particular brand of cheeky, energetic humor. When television came calling in 1950, Hill embraced the medium with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for it his entire life. The visual dimension of television transformed what he was able to do. Physical comedy, facial expressions, elaborate costume changes, split-second reaction shots. All of it became available to him in ways that radio simply couldn't accommodate. He threw himself into the work with a relentless creative energy that would characterize his entire career. The Benny Hill Show premiered on the BBC on January 15, 1955, and it announced itself immediately as something different. Drawing from the tradition of British music hall entertainment, the show blended live sketches with pre-recorded segments, giving Hill room to experiment with a range of formats. His humor leaned on slapstick, double entendres, sharp parody, and visual gags, a combination that appealed to viewers across different ages and backgrounds. By the time the show moved from the BBC to Thames Television in 1969, it had already established itself as one of the most popular programs on British television. But the move to Thames represented a genuine creative leap. Rather than producing weekly episodes, Hill and Thames agreed to a format of longer, one-hour specials. This gave Hill more time to develop complex sketches, polish his material, and invest in higher production values. The result was a show that felt bigger, more ambitious, and more cinematic than almost anything else on British television at the time. The international success that followed was staggering. The show was broadcast in over 140 countries. In the United States, it was syndicated across major television networks, earning Emmy Award nominations for Outstanding Variety in both 1980 and 1981. In 1984, Hill received the prestigious Rose d'Or Award, cementing his reputation as one of the most significant figures in global television comedy. At his peak, Benny Hill wasn't just a British institution. He was a worldwide phenomenon. To appreciate why the show eventually fell apart, it's necessary to understand what made it work for so long, and what, in retrospect, contained the seeds of its own destruction. The Benny Hill Show was built around a series of recurring elements that audiences came to love and expect. There were the elaborate character sketches, in which Hill would transform himself into an astonishing range of personas: pompous authority figures, bumbling everymen, eccentric foreigners, hapless romantics. His ability to shift between these characters with minimal costume changes and maximum physical commitment was genuinely impressive, and it earned him the respect even of people who found some of his material distasteful. There were the musical parodies, in which Hill would take a popular song and rewrite the lyrics with layers of double meaning. There were the elaborate send-ups of television genres: game shows, soap operas, news broadcasts, commercials, executed with a sharpness and attention to detail that reflected Hill's genuine intelligence as a writer and cultural observer. In 1972, he received the BAFTA Television Award for Best Writer, recognition of the fact that the comedy on his show was not accidental. It was crafted. And then there was the chase sequence, the famous runoff that ended virtually every episode of the Benny Hill Show became one of the most recognizable pieces of television in the world. Shot using a technique called undercranking, filming at a slower frame rate, and playing the footage back at normal speed. The chases created an exaggerated, speeded-up visual mayhem that was undeniably funny on a purely physical level. Hill and his cast would tear across parks, up staircases, through doorways, and along corridors, the whole thing scored to the relentless, joyful brass of Yakety Sax by Boots Randolph. The piece of music became so inseparable from Hill's brand of comedy that it is now commonly known simply as the Benny Hill theme. In 2015, it was voted the #1 television theme in a special ITV poll. The women who appeared in these chases, and throughout the show more broadly, became a defining and ultimately a deeply problematic element of the program's identity. In the early years, female characters appeared in a variety of roles, often as foils or comic participants in sketches that lampooned social conventions. But as the show evolved through the 1970s and into the 80s, the visual emphasis shifted. Women became increasingly decorative. They appeared in progressively revealing outfits. Their primary function, in many sketches and almost all of the chase sequences, was to be chased, ogled, or the subject of Hill's lustful, wide-eyed mugging at the camera. The introduction of Hill's Angels in the early 1980s crystallized this tendency into a signature feature. The Angels were a dance troupe of attractive young women who appeared in choreographed routines and comedic sketches, frequently playing opposite Hill in scenarios that emphasized their physical appearance above all else. Their presence added glamour and energy to the show, and audiences responded enthusiastically. But critics, and an increasingly vocal segment of the viewing public, began to ask an uncomfortable question. What exactly were these women for? The 1980s were a decade of profound cultural transformation in Britain, and comedy was not exempt from that transformation. A new generation of comedians was emerging from the alternative comedy scene. Performers and writers who were explicitly rejecting the conventions of traditional British light entertainment in favor of something more politically aware, more socially engaged, and more willing to challenge the assumptions baked into mainstream humor. Shows like Not the 9 O'Clock News, The Young Ones, and Saturday Live were building audiences by doing comedy that was visibly uncomfortable with the sexist and racist elements that had long been accepted as simply part of the landscape. These performers weren't just telling different jokes. They were making an argument about what comedy was for and what it did to the people who watched it. It was in this context that Ben Elton, one of the most prominent voices of the alternative comedy movement, turned his attention to The Benny Hill Show. Elton's criticisms, aired both on Saturday Live and in the pages of Q magazine in January 1987, were pointed and provocative. He argued that the show's treatment of women, the relentless pursuit, the objectification, the reduction of female characters to their physical appearance, was not harmless fun. It was, he contended, a form of cultural messaging that reinforced harmful attitudes toward women and contributed to an environment in which women felt unsafe in public spaces.